So I'm going to start about 10 years ago on March 22nd, 2013. San Francisco, the Independent Games Festival. One of the, in the award ceremony, we have the 5 finalists for the grand prize. So you may recognize a few of these games. You probably played some of them. You probably talked about some of them. But to my surprise, this game called Cart Life, about a game where you can choose these 3 people to work and tells a story about three people who work in these jobs like a newsstand or a cart and trying to make ends meet. So it's not an adventure game, it's a life simulation. It's controlled by keyboard. It was created by more or less one person, Richard Hoffmeyer. And that was a big deal because the game was created in an adventure game studio. And it's not a traditional point-and-click adventure, which is what the engine was designed for, but that kind of struck me as like a moment where this engine could do more than we thought it could do. And that's why I call this talk "That Little Engine That Could," because at that moment, for a game created with this engine to win the award, as someone who has been in the community for years, I never thought this moment would happen. So yeah, this is just the history of Adventure Game Studio and the engine and the games in the community. A little bit about myself. My name is Edmundo Ruiz Ghanem. Online, I go by Edmundito. I've been a member of the AGS community since 2001, long before I started working on games professionally and back when I was in high school. I've been a collaborator on several AGS games. You'll probably see my name in the credits. I'm the author of the AGS Twinning Library, which has become essential to many of the modern games made in Adventure Game Studio today. I went to Carnegie Mellon down the street and got a Master's of Entertainment Technology. I worked in games as a full-time game developer for some time. Currently, I'm not. Some disclaimers. I'm very excited about this talk, but there's so many games I could talk about, and I can only choose a few of them. It's not going to cover it's not going to be a comprehensive history of all the games. The Adventure Game Studio website has about 2,700 games listed, and I think there's more that are not even listed there. So there's a lot of great games that are out there, a lot of ones that made an impact during their times, but I just didn't get a chance to mention it. There may also be some mention of games that have problematic plot lines. I try to avoid. I had to include them because they were important to the history of the community. So yeah, so what am I going to talk about today? So I'm going to start at the very beginning, at the origins of Adventure Game Studio, talk about some of the first games, talk about a little bit about community and the activities that happened around it, just engine updates and how games reacted to those updates. Later on, the open sourcing and some more recent developments, and then a little bit about the future. Hopefully we'll have time for Q&A. We'll see. So yeah, in 1995, is where it all began. That was for point-and-click adventures. That was a big year. There were, if you're familiar with the Sierra and LucasArts, we got two LucasArts games and 3 Sierra games in that year. So that was like the big studios were still making these games. It was very popular. But somewhere in England, this fellow named Chris Jones, I'm not going to call him CJ for the rest of the talk. He was a very proficient programmer, very young, and he was fascinated with computer graphics. And at the same time, he was playing a game called Space Quest 4 that was released in 1991, so just a few years before. And in his own words, when he played that game, he was very intrigued. And he said, in his website he wrote, "I realized that such a simple idea of a character moving over pre-rendered backgrounds could be so effective. I made a simple game with 6 rooms using it, and that's how it stayed. It never even left my hard disk. So this is what the game looked like. Kind of like a copy of the Space Quest 4 interface. There was a scoring system, not a really great game, so very humble beginnings. We skip to 1990s, and as he mentioned, the game never left his hard disk. It was just, he did the project and he kind of put it on hold until 1997. And again, another year of adventure, of really memorable adventure games. But as you can see, I couldn't even fill the screen because we're starting to see the decay of big studios moving to other things. And the reason for that is, 1997 is, we already have the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation, and 3D gaming is just the new hot thing. So all these studios are starting to focus on 3D games and kind of moving away from some of the genres that defined the previous era. But in that same year, Chris decided to upload his project and as adventure creator and put it online. And this is what it looked like back then. So you have this is the room editor. So you open the rooms and you can set your areas to move around. You can set the edges of the screen. So like if you reach an edge, you go to the other room. And you can write scripts that trigger behaviors. So for example, if you click on a door, what can you do? And you could drag script as well. And that was about it. There was a way to do also like text scripting, but it was fairly simple. Everything went in one file, and you'd have to say, like, for example, like, hey, we'll run script 1, and then in the file you'd be like, this is what script 1 does. So you'd have to have a mental map of like what everything did, which meant you couldn't make really big games because it was too complicated to make everything to track everything that you were doing. Another part of the project was just to set up your settings and publish it. And it was also built in DOS. CJ was a really big fan of DOS at the time, and so he wrote everything in DOS. And so that was a huge barrier of entry for anyone already using Windows and trying to download, wanting something simpler. So he released it. There was not a lot of activity happening. He got a few emails that encouraged him to keep working on it, and a lot of discussion. He set up a message board, and some people were discussing about it. But a lot of I couldn't find any of the games that were made back then. And so he worked on it for a couple of years. In 1999, Adventure Creator became 2.0, and it was called Adventure Game Studio. And you can see here, this is the original editor made in back then. And it has your room editor as it did before, but a lot more options. Had a more comprehensive way of managing the sprites, inventory, character animations, and user interfaces. You could customize the user interface. The mouse cursors as well, fonts, dialogue, and many other options. Some interesting here, you can see here at the top corner is that as Chris started out just duplicating the Sierra style, but as he got more feedback from people using the engine, he started incorporating more what we call LucasArts elements. So you can see on the top says like you can enable LucasArts style speech, which means like when the characters speak, the text appears above their heads instead of like in a portrait with a text or in some other way. And then for scripting the game, there was an interaction editor. You have your event, for example, in here you can see, look at an object, and you're going to display a message 5, whatever that means. Or when you interact with an object, you can run a script. And you could use the same old editor, exactly the same it was at 1.0. Or now you can write scripts in different files. So that made it a lot easier to write more complex scripts as well. Again, this is made in DOS. And when it came out, some people were attracted to the potential of it, but others were turned off, and that was a big. At the time, it was very controversial that there was no Windows version of this, and that was a huge barrier for entry at that point. One of the first games that was released with this engine was one called the Book of Spells by Spyrus, was his username. And it was a very basic game where this character talks to this little wizard, and it gets transported into an anachronistic past in kind of in a humorous way. There's kind of humor as well. And I would consider this to be kind of like one of the first completed games with original art for Adventure Game Studio. But then it was followed by a more interesting game called Larry Vale's Traffic Division, where the basic plot is that this robot named Lovely Rita, like the Beatles song, it goes berserk, and the police department, they don't want to send anybody, so they send the last person in the list, which is Larry Vales, who works in the traffic division, to stop Rita. And so it's you can see the artwork is very, very simple, probably created in Microsoft Paint, but it showcased, like, the thing about this game is that it showcased what the engine could do, and also it was really surprisingly, like, well, primitive. The writing was very catchy and the story was very intriguing as you played it. And so this started to attract more people into the community and started to use the engine more. Another game that was attracted more authors was Better Days of the Defender of the Universe. And this is about a fellow named Rob Blanc. He's kind of like a fast food worker in the UK, and he gets selected to become the defender of the universe by these supernatural beings, and gets transported on a mission to save the spaceship. And it's kind of like the overall game is very, very small. It's kind of like Escape the Room, where the room is actually the spaceship, and you unlock a few doors and kind of get to resolve the mystery. And then Ben Crawshaw followed with 3 more games in the trilogy, which is now known as the Rob Blanc trilogy. At the same time, around that time, there was a forum that was created, and this is when these 2 games came out, everyone who was in there at the time started seeing these games. It's like, oh, now I can make my own games. And so they started coming into the forum and started talking about it and how to create these games. And over time, the forum evolved, and this is like way beyond the time. But there was all these activities that started to happen that attracted more people. So like there was the monthly game jams with a theme called Mags. The Sprite Jam attracted artists who just wanted to do sprites. People who like doing backgrounds, they worked on the background blitz. Sometimes, people were bored on a weekend, and they would just try to see what is the worst game you can make in an hour as well. Later on, there was like a one game competition where you would try to make a game that just took place in one room. Then later on as well, the fortnightly writing competitions for people who are more into writing. Eventually the AGS Awards, and another project called Reality on the Norm. And I will talk about that now. That happened in the next year in 2001. Ben Crawshaw came back and decided to create this series called Reality of the Norm. And this is very unique to adventure games too. I don't think I've ever seen anything like this before or since. But what he did was he created this game called Luncheon of the Damned, and then he shared the assets and the stories, and it was like an open source story. So like the next person would take the game and create what happened next after that. They could remix the art or create new art as well. And so a few games were made from this. So we started out with Luncheon of the Damned. Another notable one that came later was I Spy from Anthony Hahn. And Anthony was like a very good, at the time he was a very good artist for what he was doing. And he started adding shading to the backgrounds, which was like something that everybody loved. I made this game called Blast Off. This is one of the few IGS games I made back then, but it kind of got me into the engine and how it worked. It was just kind of like a proof of concept. There was another one that went completely off called Nihilism by Captain Mosley. A newcomer called Dave Gilbert, and you may recognize him later. He made this game. His first game was called The Repossessor, about the Green Reaper coming back to repossess a zombie that went loose on Luncheon of the Damned. And then Francisco Gonzalez made a game called The Lost Treasure of Reality on the Norm, which is this pirate is trying to find a lost treasure there. Eventually becomes the postman in the town. So yeah, so like what's great about these games? So there was a low barrier of entry, share assets, low expectations. The authors could extend existing characters and storylines to create new ones. It had a traditional LucasArts style design principle, so it wasn't too much out of the box. The games were like, you had your inventory, you got some dialogue, you solve some problems. It's kind of goofy. The stories are absurd. But overall, 90 games were made with Reality on the Norm, and the last one was released in 2019, which I was surprised. Most of the activity happened in the first few years, and it kind of weaned down, but people were still talking about it and trying to make games with it. Then in the same year, in 2001, this group of developers who are decided to be anonymous. So this is Anonymous Game Developers Interactive. And the reason for that is one of the project they wanted to work on was they wanted to take the original King's Quest and remake it using similar graphics to what you see in the later King's Quest games. And they released this game called King's Quest I, The Quest for the Crown. And this game was very impressive compared to what was there before. As you saw, like a few slides ago, I was just showing games created with very simple backgrounds. But this game took a whole, it was made by a team. It had full voice acting. It had beautiful music, very pretty graphics, and worked within limitations of the engine. So yeah, so it was a faithful recreation of the original. It had an open world-like navigation like the original King's Quest, inventory, full voice acting, and a feature of Sierra Games, which is death. You could die for unknown reasons. All of that was really faithful as well. And it was followed later on by King's Quest II, King's Quest III, and eventually a Quest for Glory 2 remake as well. So that was another moment where people realized this is the little engine that could, because it was another leap with the limitations that were given at the time. Another game that really kind of set the stage in that same year was another game called Playerburg Dark Ages, about a fictional city called Playerburg that reformed its police system, and now it's free of crime. But there's something sinister going on. And this was created by Krill Blomquist. And some of the features they used for to tell the story was like he introduced like the ideas like a screen where you could send and receive emails and search, a map screen some of the dialogue systems as well. But I think some of the interesting things about this game was that like the structure of the narrative was really nicely divided into like 4 days that split into morning, afternoon, evening. There was a core routine where every day you wake up maybe you have a dream or something that happens that kind of gets the player excited about. You wake up, you go to the office, get your assignment about what happened, and you go off and investigate and kind of make progress. Each day kind of ended in a cliffhanger, so it just kept you going. There was also a team of supporting characters. You have your boss, you have the tech guy, and you have the other stuff that I mentioned as well. You also get points for making progress, and the LucasArts dialogue. This is one of those first games that starts the style, what I call the adventure game studio style, in that authors started mixing what the big companies were doing, and instead of sticking to really strict philosophies on how the games will be designed, they picked and chose pieces from that. In this example in Playerburg, Krill picks points, but also he uses a LucasArts style dialogue, and there's no real way to die in the game. So he takes the best of every single piece of what was learned, what was back then, and starts to make a new kind of style that is agnostic of a specific philosophy. In 2002, we have the first AGS Awards, and of course, the two big winners are King's Quest I and Playerburg for different reasons. King's Quest more on the artistic side, and Playerburg more, and it was actually the game voted the game of the year just because of its length and its scope. And in that same year, 2002, things are moving fast. There's AGS 2.4, and finally, the thing that everybody wanted, a Windows editor. And so it's more or less the same editor as before, but now translated to Windows. And this opened the gates for more people to come in and actually start using the engine. The editor works the exact same way as the previous one. It's just a lot more, the user experience is a lot more easy to manage. And the interactions, now the graphical scripts have moved to this system called the interaction editor, where you could graphically still script the events. And additionally, now the script editor was embedded into the editor, and so you could have more room to write scripts as well. So you had two options at the time. And another thing was a new help system that was very comprehensive also made it a lot easier for people to kind of know what you can do with the engine as well. Now we're in 2003. An interesting game. The art is getting better. The style is getting better. Ian and Greg, they made this lovely little short game called Apprentice that kind of set a new bar for how the game should be made, and it had really lovely art style. And mind you, that Adventure Game Studio at this time is still limited to 256 color palette. So what they had to do, the challenge here for the time was like everything had to be reduced color-wise to actually fit within that parameter. And another game that came out was the first commercial game in Adventure Game Studio was The Adventures of Fat Man. And actually, I have the game right here with me. So, again, being a community member, this was a big moment. I mean, it's the year 2003. There's no stores online. Nobody can publish games, and the game came out in a CD. So here's the CD-ROM. I actually have the receipt saved here. I don't know why, but the game cost $14.95. I paid it with PayPal. There was still, this was the first game that was commercially released. There was some discussion over whether games should be commercially released or not. It kept going for some time. But in the meantime, in the free world, Ben Croshaw came back with another interesting game called 5 Days a Stranger. And the design of this game is more of a mystery mansion type game. With it's about a kind of a gentleman thief called Trilby who gets stuck in this house with his other cast of characters, and they can't get out of the house. And there's like a kind of serial killer inside the house, so they have to figure out what's going on. And in the mystery house kind of setting, there's like secret passages and maps and all these mysteries get uncovered. Huge hit. He followed it with a few more games in something that is now called a show Mythos as well. So we start seeing like more and more series of games that have sequels as well. So the games keep maturing. And between 2002 and 2003, there was a lot of improvements to the AGS engine. One of them was the addition of Ogg Vorbis. And I think there was MP3 support before. But we're still at a time where bandwidth is so small, the games have to be kept small. And with Ogg, it just made the ability to create digital sound and music a lot smaller, enough for somebody to be able to download the game. Other things was mouse wheel, 800 by 600 resolution, editor and engine plugins, lip syncing support. There was some early Linux engine support that was kind of there, but it didn't really mature until later. And then finally, the ability to have artwork with 32 bits and alpha channels, and that made things just like forget about the palette. Now you can use all the colors in the world, or quite a few. And then PNG file support made things easier as well. So things were getting a lot easier to do after these by 2003. I'm gonna pause for. I'm gonna focus a little bit on editor and engine plugins, because this was a big step. You could extend the editor and the engine. Most of the work that was done then at the time was to extend the engine. And some of the examples here is like the ability to add snow and rain to your game. Later on, you can open a URL. So like if you had your website, it's like, hey, I want to go to my website, it will open a URL. Flash that effect. Later on, Steam support to be able to connect into the Steam system. And then there was an editor plugin that just kind of made voice acting more manageable. That will come later on as well. 2004, Francisco Gonzalez created the Ben Jordan series with the first game, and he followed it with a series of 8 games and a couple of remakes throughout from 2004 to 2012. And it kind of starts an era of AGS games that are like, kind of, at the same time we're seeing some episodic games coming from Telltale in the mainstream, and also like we see like it starts, like developers are trying to like really crank out games and get a lot better at them each game that comes out. So these are like great. These games were free, very lovable, and you can see the growth from Francisco's growth from the very beginning to 2012 as well. 2005, AGS 2.7 is released. The way you script is more object-oriented, if you're familiar with that. It just makes things a lot more easy to find. And the other big addition is the script module support. And that's similar to the plugins. You could write scripts in the game and export them and other people could use them. And so a lot of the script modules that came out of this that were popular were the speech bubble plugin, the credits, an ability to roll credits, better ways to save and delete, manage saving games, tweening, advanced lip syncing, parallax scrolling, smooth cameras. You see that here that the toolbox is still building up, and we're yet to see games that kind of converge into that, and we'll see that soon. In 2006, the anonymous game developers decided to not be anonymous anymore, and now they have a studio called Himalaya, and they released another commercial game called Alamo and the Lost Dutchman's Mine. And it's another ambitious project that they made, much higher resolution graphics, a lot of like animation, richer colors as well, and they sell the game for a very high price of $30. I mean, it's not that high, but for the time, it was a very a very controversial price, and they had to explain why they thought it would cost this much. But the same year, there was also MAX had been going on, as I mentioned before, the monthly adventure game competition had been going on before. And the 5th anniversary was coming up. And so they said, like, hey, just pick any theme from a previous MAX game. And so this game that eventually cost $4.99, called The Shiva, used a theme called Conspiracy. And this game, you may be familiar with it, but it's about a rabbi who is losing faith and finds like someone who used to attend his temple died and left some information for him. And so he goes into this investigation and finds that there's kind of something sinister going on. And it's based in New York City. It's made by Dave Gilbert. And it uses a lot of elements that are very rooted to reality. There's like, you travel around Manhattan, you visit, like kind of like what is an apartment like in Manhattan, very small. You kind of, and you have your screen. But one of the big things about this game, a couple of things, is one of them is the game talks a lot about Jewish culture, something that kind of introduced, and that's was kind of like it had a purpose. Like the game, he gave it a purpose to kind of teach people about what is, what would they not, like it talks about Shivas, it talks about some of the terms. You could pull this up and kind of learn about that. And it kind of talks a little bit about the politics of like the religion within New York City. And so Dave demoed this game at an IGDA event in New York City, and it got some attention. This is the Gamma Sutra, now called the Game Developer Magazine, talking about the game. And another, so that got a lot of attention, and then it came on Kotaku. So it broke out of that. At this point, like most of the games were like within the community, and now they started to break out of that. And this game talks about the other notable feature of the game, which is like the rabbi can also fight, and you fight through conversation, and your goal is to kind of win. So it got a lot of attention, enough that it ended up in the Game Developers Choice Award as Best New Studio, which was unthinkable. And once again, the little engine that could. Somehow we have broken out of the community. Someone from the community was able to create a game that would have cultural impact in that year. And of course, like, that company became What Jedi Games. The next game that Dave would work on is going back to a game that he created back in 2003 called Bestowers and Eternity. But this time around, he had better ideas on how to make it, and so that became the Blackwell Legacy. And as I said, it's Dave Gilbert and a team, because I think at this point you start seeing that the community is starting to come together to actually work on these games. And he was able to hire Ian from the Apprentice game I showed earlier to work on some of the character art. He found someone in the Sprite forums named Matt who worked on some of the concept art. And this game is not an AGS game, but someone who was part of the community named Chris Fimo, he did some of the backgrounds as well. So these games are no longer being made by just one person, but it starts to have a team around people from the community, from all the work from the community has been building up on. And it has a few of the tools I've shown before. It has a map screen. It has the concept similar to Playerberg of like days occurring. It takes place in a couple of days. There's some close-ups of like letters, and there's like a lot more environmental storytelling. There's context as well in the apartment, and you can, photography. One notable feature is this dialogue system where as you talk to people and gather clues, you write them in your notebook, and you try to find contradictions or similarities between the different topics. And so as you can click on one and another and kind of combine them and see if there's more you can press on and interrogate more about. Another feature was that you can switch between the main character, Rosa, and your helper ghost, Joey, to get abilities you couldn't do before. So one of the things that Joey can do is he can talk to the other ghosts. And Rosa's only ability is to be able to take ghosts to the other, to the afterlife. And so he has that ability, and he can walk through walls and things like that. And so it adds a little bit of like part of both the narrative and the gameplay kind of intertwined there. And yeah, as I said, Rosa's goal is to get people to their afterlife and kind of find some of why they died in the first place, and it's always a kind of a dark secret behind that. And Dave continued to work on these games as What Jedi Games for a long time, improving upon each game and kind of learning to become make more sophisticated games as well. 2008, this is the year the year before the iPhone came out, so now we start to see like mobile has now become a new platform. And Adventure Game Studio's out, but it doesn't support phones yet. Adventure Game Studio 3 has a new editor, has been rewritten from the ground up, as well as a lot of new features. But you can see it still remains to be very similar in the way you make games. And not a lot has changed, it just makes the user experience a lot better. And some of the improvements throughout the time was like add support for like 3D, like graphics acceleration, bigger resolutions. The audio system was rewritten, and that was a big feature because you can now do crossfading and other effects that you couldn't do before. And you could, and one big feature that was added was you could write scripts inside the dialogue editor. I'm going back here and showing you what the dialogue editor looked like in the original AGS2, and it didn't really change much. It's in AGS3. It was the same, more or less the same. It's just translated to a much simpler interface, but it's very tedious. It's like it was designed for an interrogation type dialogue. So you could, like for example, like you talk to a character and it pops out all these options, and then you dig deeper and deeper and deeper. So you couldn't do like really branching dialogue or anything more sophisticated than that. And so every time all the script was written in one file, and so when you wanted to do something before, you'd have to say like, hey, like I want to do something more advanced. I have to over here say, hey, I want to run script 1, and then in another script it said like you have this function that says like, oh, if you set 1, you're gonna give the player inventory, and so on and so forth. So you'd have this like huge file, and that would make the ability to write really complex dialogues really difficult. In the new version, you didn't have to worry about that. You could just write the script right on the dialogue system. And so that changed how we think. While the dialogue editor was limited, that gave more opportunity for developers to really start experimenting more with what kind of dialogues they could design as well. That same year, another notable game came out called Been There, Done That by Dan Marshall and Ben Ward, a comedy game. And now we're going back in this, more of a throwback style, kind of more a comedy game as well. Got a lot of attention outside of the community. Another lovely game was called Nanobots by Erin Robinson, and it kind of shows her style, her pixel style very strongly, and just kind of has like this like unique style to it. And in 2010, another game comes out that takes over the awards, called The Journey Down Over the Edge, using some really beautiful graphics and kind of like referencing some African art to kind of create a imaginary world as well. And this was created by a group of Swedish developers by the name of Sky Goblin, who later on actually, once this game was a success, they used it as a proving ground to write a complete new engine. They had resources to run their own engine, and then wrote their own series with their own engine. But they used Adventure Game Studio as a starting point for their careers, and like not take the risk of writing their own engine first and then making the game. That same year, there was another interesting development, which was that this is what CJ wrote in the forum, that basically he wasn't able to work on the editor anymore of the engine. He just didn't have the time to do it, and he wanted to know what to do. Like, one option was like, well, that's just it, and like, I'm going to abandon it. What he really wanted was to share the engine and have someone take over. But he couldn't find someone who, like a specific one, a single author who could do it. So the option, he decided to make the engine open source and start sourcing it. And it just kind of went on. It's like a lot of people started forking the engine and making changes, but nothing came out of it. It just was nothing was organized at that point. But in the meantime, people are working on games. And in 2010, 2011, this Wajirai helps this student developer named Josh Nuremberger to release this game called Gemini Rue. And he worked on it as a student. But mostly, he did the art and the programming and the style. But this game, once again, changed everything about AGS, because this is the game that kind of starts converging a lot of the things I've been talking about. You can see here in the screenshot, you have like the rain effects, you have really beautiful art, you have some of the use of the modules as well. And so it starts to become like the environments kind of become moody in these games, and kind of like attracts a new kind of style that it's more mature in artistically. And this is also another big feature of this game is that there's a gunplay. So you can see here on the top right of the screen, there's a gunfight, which was very appealing to players, as well as like some screens and maps and stuff like that. And it kind of really set the mood of like this really immersive cyberpunk type game. And what Dave tried to do at Wajirai, he wanted to get this game on Steam, which was starting to open the doors more and more. But as I asked him about it, he said that it was very difficult. Actually, in Steam, Valve did not really want to get the game on Steam for reasons, and probably because it was too pixelated and too small, and the resolution wasn't right or anything like that. Eventually, he got it in, and it became one of the most popular indie adventure games in the platform, surprisingly enough. Not surprising, because it's a really great game. And then after that, finally, CJ is able to get AGS 3.2.1, and he by the open source changes made by the forks, and actually started integrating them back into AGS. And this will be the last version that CJ would manage. After that, he definitely didn't have time and kind of passed the engine on. 2012, another game created called Primordia, published by Wajirai Games, is released, and once again, kind of has a style similar to Gemini Rue, and it has like a really moody style, and kind of immerses you in the environment, and it uses a lot of the once again takes full advantage of the modules and a lot of the customization that hadn't been done before in the engine to do that. And this was done by a team. There was a specific artist, a really experienced programmer, and someone doing the writing and designing. And so you see that the games are starting to get more sophisticated as we keep moving to the present. Someone just recently said, when the Switch version came out, that the story is still great today because of the setting and brilliant writing. The story itself is good, but the characters around the world make Primordia shine in a genre that's packed into the gills with similar titles. I find myself wanting to jump back over and over because the story or the characters, many of which are enthralling. So it's a game that it was very well received as well, very popular on Steam. And of course, once again, Wajirai had issues with the release, and they were still very unsure about whether they wanted to approve this game or not. So it wasn't, my point is that it wasn't easy to really get these games beyond that. Even at this time, Primordia perhaps was one of the last games that Wajirai was still really selling on DVDs and actually having their own download portal. So there was other ways to get the game. But around this time, around 2013, Steam started to change their policy, and other portals start to become available, like Good Old Games, etc. And this is where we start seeing more of these games outside of the community, too. There was another publisher called Screen 7. They had been around that scene for a while, but now they kind of got serious about publishing games. They published another game that kind of has like this moody style called The Cat Lady. Yeah, so I think it's, my text is wrong there, but yeah, so the cat Lady, again, has a really unique artwork, kind of atmospheric, kind of grim, also comes out on Steam. 2013, Gemini Rue is the first game that comes out on the apps on iOS. Wajirai had been working on the iOS port for some time and finally made a breakthrough and was able to release the game on iOS. And then Cardlight comes out on that year as well, and wins that award. 2014, the community, this new project manager, Crimson Wizard, he starts getting the changes together and finally releases the first community release. Kind of taking the work of like what people have been doing on the site and putting it all together, improvements to the editor, improvements to the engine. The main features were the improved support for reading ports, all the iOS work that Wajirai Games had done back into the engine, Linux, iOS, PSP for some reason. There was like some rendering improvements, and there was more lip sync support for other systems. That same year, also three new commercial games. Francisco Gonzalez and Wajirai, he releases his first commercial game through Wajirai Games called A Golden Wake. It kind of like some of the folks that worked on those Quest for Glory remakes, they joined together as a new company called Infamous Quest, and they made Quest for Infamy very in a similar style. And this longtime community member, Peter Lundqvist, and the new publisher, Screen 7, they released this game on Steam called The Samaritan Paradox as well. So now we're getting to 2015. There's another game, another well-received cyberpunk game called Techno Babylon. Again, Steam is they really like the audience likes their cyberpunk games a lot, and so this is another game that kind of combined all what you can do with the engine and really shine as well. So yeah, so 2016, we're getting close. AGS 3.4. This is the first version that the community releases that has new improvements to the engine. So it's a big milestone for the team working open source. You can export to Linux from the AGS editor directly instead of doing very complicated things. You can set any custom game resolutions that makes it easier to port the game to other platforms beyond PCs. So like in iOS, you can do vertical, horizontal screens, etc. OpenGL support. It seems small, but increasing all the limits on resources, so you can have more objects in the room, more of everything as well, and also expanding the scripting to be more modern as well. Around this time, another company comes in called Raw Fury. They're a publisher from Sweden, and they decide to publish this game called Kathy Rain, directed by Joel Staffhastel, and it's about this woman named Kathy Rain. She's kind of cool. She's cool. She rides a bike, much cooler than me. And it's kind of she finds out one of her relatives dies and goes into this like kind of like going back and see what your family is about. But also there's a supernatural mystery. And once again, this game combines like all the elements of like what AGS games have become. It has like close-ups on books. It has like really customized user interface. It has a really cool map screen where every new location unlocks at the top left. You can do some hacking of like old devices like you wouldn't be using anymore, like a cassette tape or an old computer. And so yeah, so like really high-res pixel art, What Jedi Games was involved in the voice act directing, and there's a new, and it took actually 4 years to develop. So the games have gone to have taken longer. There's the original post on the forum by Clifftop Games, which is the developer of the title, and you can see here it's 2012, and there's a little log, but it took about 4 years to actually get the game completed. So the games are no longer simple to make and as they used to. There was another follow-up to another remake to this game called the Director's Cut. This was remade in Unity over time, and the reason was mainly just the ability to export to other platforms easier. So that was there's still another challenge with AGS at the time, despite having the ability to create different builds for different platforms. 2018, this is another big year for AGS games. Dave Gilbert and Ben Charlin as artists, they created this game Unavowed that pushes the engine to its limits. You have a cast of characters that you can choose from to solve different missions. The game is structured into different chapters, so it's almost episodic, but there's an overarching story arc. And so within each episode, you're in the subway, in the New York subway, and you can pick which of the other two characters is going to go with you. Your main character, very uniquely designed to be mostly silent for most of the game, in a similar way that Link in Zelda is like a character like in Zelda, which is just unusual for a point-and-click adventure. And another interesting thing about the game, as they're walking around, they're having contextual conversations about things like the two characters behind you, and just kind of talking in the background, which is something that hadn't been seen before. Lots of visual effects, lots of like beautiful art and music as well. And it was nominated for Excellence in Narrative at the Independent Games Festival. And it was also, it had a Golden Joystick also nominated for Best Storytelling as well. So very well received. A new publisher came also into the scene called Application System Heidelberg. Big fan of adventure games, so they published their first AGS game, Lamplight City by Francisco Gonzalez. Again, another game with really rich, beautiful backgrounds, using everything that the engine can do. A really deep and immersive storyline, and a really interesting feature of this game is that you can see Francisco's maturity here, because he drops he starts to experiment by not having an inventory in the game, and just having it all based on dialogue and exploration and investigation and clues. So you can start seeing how developers that started many years ago are now comfortable to say, like, well, I don't need to follow the rules that I'm familiar with, and now I can start experimenting with new ideas and see where we go. Whispers of the Machine is another great game that came out around that time, and it has a lot of those tools, a lot of really rich user interface design, a lot of like manipulation of audio, and it's once again another game that really pushes the engine. And then 2019, we got AGS 3.5, support for much larger files. It introduces the concept of a camera and multiple cameras, and updates the walking algorithm with A-Star, which is the gold standard of pathfinding. A notable game of that time was Sumatra, the game Fate of Yandi. This game is about a logging worker who gets caught in a terrible landslide, leaving him lost and alone and deep in the jungle. So he's trying to find his best friend and trying to return home. So it's like a very kind of like a more very interesting story behind it. And a new publisher called Ratalaika Games releases this game called My Big Sister. It was created in AGS, but the first game that they write a custom adapter to their engine that uses Adventure Game Studio, and they're able to publish the game in Switch and the PlayStation 4 and Xbox. And this is the first game that gets published into those platforms. And surprisingly, the game doesn't really look like an AGS game. It looks like an RPG-like adventure, and it's about two sisters who are trying to get back home after being kidnapped by strangers, and try to figure out what to do. But it has a lot of like lightning effects and really interesting things that another game that's like off the tools that are provided by the engine and creates its own system within it. 2020, 2021, there's another really interesting game, and now we're seeing a game that, again, like really intricate background work. Another game that's also outside of the box has an isometric style called on a winter's night for travelers. It's split into 4 parts, 4 different unique stories that are very tragic, very, very interesting, very grim stories, very tragic stories. Really well received. This is the game that's like, it's a game of the year. It wins the Adventure Games AGS Award of the Year, and it's free. And in the same year, Sumatra Ferohyandi is the first game that comes out on PlayStation 5. Rather Laika Games, once again, use their technology to be able to do this, but it's possible. Last year, another really interesting game is Perfect Tides. And so now you see here, Perfect Tides is I wish I had videos to show it, but the animation this is designed by Meredith Grant. She's a comic book artist animator, and wrote and designed the game as well, and did all the animations. And it has like it's a slice of life tale about a girl coming of age story. She lives in an island off of New York, and kind of has adventures with some things, some of her friends and stuff. But a couple of the interesting things about this game is that it kind of goes back to that retro style that Sierra had in terms of like the basic structure of the game. It's like you have puzzles to solve, you have like your classic interface on the top of the screen, but it does that nostalgically and in a way to kind of reminisce the time of the time and place of the game. The character in the story is really similar to the story I tell now. It's about a lonely teenager who's aspiring. She's an aspiring writer, and she goes online on forums to kind of like create her own writing work and share that material. So it's just kind of, in almost in a way, kind of like a game that understands how the AGS community also got formed. In this case, in a similar way. And one of the interesting things is it has multiple endings, and they're based on decisions that you make, but not about action, most about decisions you make about your relationship. So if you have a relationship with someone and you kind of forget to follow up on things, eventually that would kind of impact what the ending would do. But the game will not really tell you, and it would have different endings that are ambiguously gray in terms of like there's no good ending or bad ending. There's just like you get a different outcome based on the decisions that you made and the things that you did or did forget to do. Yeah, so it's self-published. It was the first game made in AGS by Meredith Grant. It has a traditional interface and puzzle design, but the choices are more relationship-based. There's no voice acting, and the music was made by Danny Collards from Catherine. And the reason he did that is because like she was looking for someone to do music and couldn't find someone, and someone in the forum through the forum connections that happened as well. So now we get to the present day. And things are already happening. Just recently, AGS 3.6 was released. It has more, it's kind of starting to expand to be more, it has Unicode support, improves flag compression, the ability to export to web. The font rendering has been rebuilt to actually support Unicode, and still currently improving the script performance so the games can run faster. But one of the biggest features is that the game Adventure Game Studio had been created with a library called Allegro for years, and they finally switched to this one called SDL that just makes it a lot easier for the team to be able to expand the graphical capabilities. And so there's a lot of games in production, and this is the screenshot of the forum. Cardlight just came out on 2023, but it was apparently was rebuilt in Unity. So it had gone disappeared and then finally came back, and now it's available just this year. It's available once again on PCs, Macs, and mobile devices. An upcoming game that's showing some of these features that I mentioned in AGS 3.6 and 3.5 that are like expand all the resources, compressed graphics, larger rooms, is Rosewater. This game is designed in like in an HD resolution, very rich graphics, a lot of animation, a lot of objects on the screen. You have a cast of characters and a world to explore. Another game that's Wajara is working on is Old Skies in a similar style. It's now expanding to an HD look. You can see here, for example, it's using one of the modules called the speech bubble. That's not something that AGS does out of the box. And it's using a lot more richer animations, more content. And so you can see that some of those new engine shifts are starting to pay off. But at the same time, there's another game called The Crimson Diamond that kind of goes back to the 1980s, done by designer Julia Milamana, and she's trying to recreate the style of those old Sierra games, and it's a text parser game, which are as well. So this is an interesting time even now. And just like last week, the AGS for early alpha comes out as well. Which includes the ability to, the way the files are set up is separate, so it makes it easier for collaboration, which had been a problem for a long time. A new compiler that is not tied specifically to Windows, and then new scripting capabilities as well. So that's the little engine that could. So like looking back, I think the reason I wanted to do this talk was to see like how do the games evolve? How does the engine is able to, despite all its hardships, able to enable the ability for people to create games. And I think my conclusion is that while there is a time that developers, like as a designer, there's going to be a period of maturity. You're going to work, a lot of the people who worked on these games, they started out with really working within the box of what AGS could do. And then eventually, as they got matured, they're able to break it out and actually do what they want without having to necessarily switch the engine to another engine. And another thing, I think it's also the understanding of like how these different layers over time kind of accumulate into these games. And we're now seeing a point where if you ask me, like, is AGS dead? No, it's actually, we're seeing some of the best games we're seeing are coming out, are in development right now. So for me, I think the future for the engine looks very bright, and I'm looking forward to seeing what's next. And I have 2 minutes for questions. Any questions? I think you may have to turn it on. I can repeat the question as well.
Okay. Thank you for the talk. That was really exhaustive. Do you know of any women who were part of the early stages of AGS? Because now you talked, for example, of the Crimson Diamond, but I noticed there's like the room suddenly changed the demographic when this session started. I'm like, is this like because it's like a techie thing? It's like, are there women that were in the early story of AGS that you can think of? Like, just like if there's any that come to mind, or is that something that is happening now? Like we have more women making games with AGS.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's like Julia is one of the, she's a recent, she's recently joined the community just a few years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, when she decided to make the Crimson Diamond. There was also Erin Robinson, was a well-known developer. She designed a few games in Adventure Game Studio. Currently, she is she works for, I think, a big game studio. But yeah, overall, I think it's a really valid question. A lot of the community had mostly been like, if I could, the demographics are probably like, in the very beginning, probably about like teenagers to mid-20s males. That was most of the community. So yeah, let me think about that. There was Erin, there was, yeah, good question. Yeah, and I think part of it is like, yeah, I'm not sure. I think it's like good questions to ask there. It's like who played these games, and a lot of people play adventure games for some reason. Why was this specific audience attracted to the adventure game studio and the kind of games that they make that are being made in that style. But I think nowadays, I think the thing I'm excited about now is that I think things are evolving and we're seeing more diverse voices working on these games as well. You just have more people involved that aren't just like the programmer designer type who would most likely sometimes excuse male. But things are changing as technology also evolves as well. It's attracting more diverse audiences, or more diverse authors too. One more question. All right, thank you.